Hi everyone, welcome to the third event of the NAADSN Ideas Series, NATO at 75, a four-part virtual series exploring Canada's role and involvement in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the lead up to its 75th anniversary next week on April 4th. My name is Nicholas Gillespie, the NAADSN Administrator and incoming PhD student in Canadian Studies at Trent University. The North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network is a Minds collaborative network which addresses three core policy challenges: defense in the Arctic, securing North America and enhancing continental defense, and climate change and the environment. And NAADSN engages key academic experts and stakeholders across Canada, North America, and the circumpolar Arctic to produce timely research and advice to the defense team and to foster the next generation of scholars and practitioners. And today is the third of four panels, this week exploring the alliance of the present. Our discussion will be moderated by NAADSN Research Fellow and lead of our Emerging Leaders Node, Nicole Covey, a PhD candidate in Canadian Studies at Trent University. Her research interests focus on Arctic geopolitics, Canadian foreign policy and defense and security, NATO, and she holds a Shirk Minds Joint Initiative Doctoral Award. So Nicole, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our guests, and thank you for moderating.
Well, thanks, Nick, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone who's managed to attend today's event. Well, first today we got Dr. Benjamin Zila, a visiting scholar in the Department of Government at Harvard University and a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. His research and writings are at the intersection of global governance and peace and conflict studies. In particular, he is interested in the security development nexus, fragile states, peacekeeping and peace building, human security, humanitarian interventions, international peace operations, NATO, and questions related to Canada and the world. Following Dr. Zila, we have Ms. Jennifer Tierney, who's enjoying her second term as a political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, a self-described student of Canada-U.S. bilateral relations. She's also served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Canadian Affairs in Washington. Mrs. Tierney's additional experience in the Department of State includes overseas tours and domestic tours focused on political military affairs and intelligence cooperation. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Alexander Lanskova, who is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Waterloo. He studies alliance politics, theories of war, and European security. He is the co-editor of a volume on NATO's enhanced forward presence and the author of Atomic Assurance, the Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation and Military Alliances in the 21st Century. Dr. Zila, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to this webinar. I'll start off with, there my PowerPoint is there, to talk about NATO burden sharing. I kind of titled, could you go to the next slide, please? I titled my my talk, "Is Europe and Canada free riding on NATO?" And the answer is no. And I will walk you quickly through and why I think this is the case. Working with some empirics, and that's why I prepared a PowerPoint so that people can share the numbers. Well, first off, burden sharing discussions. People should know that they have been with the alliance since the founding of NATO since 1949, and that is also in part due to the nature of the Washington Treaty. Although it laid out clearly the principles, goals, and objectives of the alliance, it did not provide a clear framework on how the organization should be financed. This was essentially in 1949 for politicians to decide. And as a result, questions of burden sharing and thus also how to best measure the fairness of an ally's contributions or lack thereof have been highly sensitive at the political level, actually since day one. The reason why they're so sensitive and why they're controversial is because they touch on the root principles of alliance cooperation and fairness. Now, aside from the politics, measuring burden sharing sort of empirically and methodologically is actually quite complex because allies have different abilities to contribute financially in terms of their national wealth. They have different military capabilities and there are different threat perceptions. Moreover, allies have different social values, strategic cultures, and ideological positions that indicate dissimilar attitudes towards the use of force. Now, in light of such analytical burden sharing complexity and political sensitivity, scholars have sought help from scientific theories to guide the empirical investigations, thinking that the theories that would lead them to better and more comprehensive conceptual understandings of burden sharing fairness. Now, this is the time when, so now I'm putting sort of my academic hat on, this is the time when collective action theory and the models originating from the field of international political economy, or IPE, entered the NATO burden sharing discussions. So Manker-Olson and Seckhauser in 1966 and so forth have started that kind of research program. Now, to be sure and to be clear, these theories were useful in providing some important, yet what I would argue mostly quantitative insights into states, into how states contribute to NATO's public goods and which states are or are not alliance-free riders. Now, against this backdrop, NATO members' share of the gross domestic product devoted to defense spending quickly became to what has been colloquially referred to as the input variable for a generation of scholars and politicians to use. Now, this GDP benchmark offers several advantages, including its clarity and ability to politically motivate action. And it's certainly in the United States, in Washington, policymakers in the White House, but also in Congress, have used the GDP benchmark ever since, and they have historically and continue to claim that the Europeans are not paying enough to NATO or for NATO. So you've seen probably Donald Trump's comments over the past few days making such suggestions. Now, it is worth mentioning that the emphasis on the 2% benchmark of GDP devoted to defense spending that NATO allies politically agreed to at their summit in 2014, I'm sure we're going to come back to that in our question and answer, and essentially that has dominated the burden sharing debate ever since, is primarily informed by these economic models of collective action and the logics that I've just suggested. So think of Manker-Olson and the arguments that they have put forward. Aside from the political pledges of spending 2% on GDP, in 2024, 18 allies have expected to meet this minimum 2% target, which is a six-fold increase compared to 2014. Now, over the past decade, especially European NATO members have collectively increased their defense spending from $235 billion in 2014, or 1.47% of their combined GDP, to $380 billion in 2024, which is about 2% of their GDP. Now, what is often forgotten in the burden sharing discussions is the output variable. And this is what I will be sort of quickly turning my eye to, because it's an important collective action shift that has taken place in the 1990s. Effectively, NATO's raison d'etre shifted from collective defense of the Cold War years towards international crisis management. And this was the first time in NATO's history that it would actually deploy forces into active combat situations outside of traditional NATO territory. The alliance, of course, intervened militarily with ground troops in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and of course in Afghanistan, often following failed attempts by other international organizations to contain the violence there. So think about the OSCE and the European Union in the early days of the Balkan Wars. Now, the point is that these new missions required a set of new capabilities, different capabilities compared to those of the Cold War, and they were often included peace building and state building tasks that combined security and development responsibilities that NATO did not have much prior experience with. So now shifting the analytical focus from the input to the output variable, I would argue allows us to better understand the production and the turnout of NATO operations, or the production of financial inputs into the alliance. I'm happy to come back. I'm just looking at the time. I'm happy to come back to talk more about the outputs and why they are important. And let's just sort of quickly look at the empirics. The first one is the implementation force. And essentially the argument that I'm trying to make here is that contrary to accepted wisdom sort of in the literature, both Canada and the European Union, or the European NATO members rather, they're not Atlantic free riders. Let's focus on the IFR mission first. Canada contributed the 9th largest force contingent to the implementation force, just out of 14 countries. If you go to the next slide, please, it was the 7th largest to SFOR, and the next slide after that is the 5th largest to ISAF. Now, I think it is impossible to interpret these force rankings as a practice of free riding or being a laggard, but rather according to what would commonly expect of Canada as a middle power. The exception to this, and that is the, if you go to the next slide, please. No, the one after that. One more. No, one more. The ISAF. No, one more. Is Operation Resolute Support, where Canada, as you can see on the screen, ranked 28 out of 29 countries. Now, shifting to the European side, America's NATO members collectively shouldered, if we go back to the first slide, please, on I4, the European member states shouldered 62.8% of the total force burden in I4, 74.1% in S4, 83.5% in K4, and 36.6% in ISAF, and 41.3% in the Operation Resolute Support. So the point that I'm making is that these high numbers are not an inclination or an indication, rather, that the Europeans were free riding. Quite to the contrary. Actually, if you look at the numbers, you will see that the Americans are actually rather free riding on the Europeans. What I will sort of close off with is two thoughts, and I will stop there. Both measuring burden sharing is complex politically, but also analytically speaking. I'm happy to talk more about the methodological problems. The second point I'd like to make is that both Canada and the European NATO member states were not free riders in the 1990s. And I'm happy to talk about the numbers as I've indicated. The third point is the 2% target is a political mechanism. It's a political target. It's not enshrined in any sort of international legal doctrine. It's a political commitment. And what I would suggest, and perhaps finish off with, is if we continue to push the fixation of the 2% goal to the extreme, as the Trump administration, it seems, tries to do, it will most likely increase the divisiveness rather than strengthening NATO's internal coherence. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Ms. Tierney, it's your turn.
All right, excellent. So I'll shift a little bit. I think I was asked to speak about how the United States and Canada cooperate at NATO, including at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. So I'll rely a bit on my personal experience for this. For those who don't know, I was the deputy political counselor at the U.S. mission to NATO from 2015 to 2018. So saw quite a few summits in my days. Before I dive into specifically how the U.S. and Canada cooperate in the NATO context, I thought I'd speak just for a few minutes about how allies cooperate or coordinate in general. So I presume the audience is familiar with the fact that NATO operates by consensus. So I think folks, certainly a couple of colleagues have heard me say that the top goal for NATO is always alliance unity. And Dr. Zyla referred to that a bit, the fact that certain issues may be a bit divisive, but the primary goal is always alliance unity. the fact that NATO operates by consensus decision making also makes it a practical necessity. So in brief, you can't get anything done at NATO if you don't operate by consensus. So how do we get there? There are a couple of key tactics that I certainly have used, and my colleagues throughout the alliance have used to secure that consensus. Before we consider, though, what tactic to use, we have to really understand where each of the allies are coming from. Pick an issue, issue X. You have to understand where each of the allies likely are. It sounds easy, but it is really not, especially as the alliance has expanded. And yay, Sweden, just throwing that out there. It does get difficult over time as the alliance expands to really understand the political drives that each government faces. Um, in the case of Canada, of course, the good news there is that generally we are compatible. Our policy positions, our general thoughts on where the alliance is going. Um, so that puts us in a unique position that we're not trying to convince Canada of the way we'd like to move forward. We're generally working together to convince other allies to support that common view that we have. So going back to the process, a couple of tactics that we use to build support. I'll just pick two, otherwise we'll be here for 4 hours. There's the first one, food for thought papers. So you may have seen these referenced in media or other NATO publications. Apologies if you're already familiar with this concept, but if we have a new idea that really has legs to it, we've built detail, we've thought about it a lot, we know where we want to go, we'll put it down on paper, and then we'll socialize it with all of the allies for consideration or discussion. It doesn't go into the NATO record. It's not something formal. It's not something that we're voting on or trying to achieve consensus on. We're just using it as a tool to share our ideas more formally with NATO allies and start the conversation going. In many cases, certainly during my time in Brussels, I worked with my Canadian colleagues to put together joint food for thought papers. So it was something that went out to the alliance that had, as we used to say, both the stars and stripes and the maple leaf on it. So that was an indication that we were doing this collaborative work together, and we were inviting other NATO allies to join us. One of the other techniques we would utilize, if we had a concept that was not really fleshed out, we were just brainstorming, we thought it might be a good idea, but we didn't really know where we wanted to go and we wanted to get allied views, we would do small groups. It's actually a more formal concept than you would think in NATO land, but we would gather small groups of particular allies to have a conversation. And going back to what I said a few minutes ago about the importance of knowing allied positions, that's key to getting the right people in the room. So as you're brainstorming, maybe you want to have people that you think would have similar views. Maybe you want to bring in an ally that may have a completely opposing view to really play devil's advocate or something like that. So you really have to think carefully when you're convening these small groups of maybe 4 or 5 allies, what you want to get out of that conversation, where you think you generally want to go, and that help drives the conversation. So some of the key efforts that NATO has engaged on over the last several years have developed as a result of these two tactics. I won't go into too many details, but we have utilized these tactics for some of the deliverables for summits, for example. Some of the resilience work, maybe something related to forward land forces. We've used this technique time and time again to help build consensus prior to a forcing function like a summit or a ministerial. But of course, this is only one part of the puzzle. Once we once we develop consensus on a particular idea or program, then the real hard work comes, ensuring successful implementation of whatever concept or program we're considering. That's where the rubber meets the road, and that's what really matters. So a couple of examples that are currently on the NATO docket um, uh, that I would offer for this. Those of you who are participating may know about DIANA, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. That aims to fund research and development for advanced technology that will ultimately somehow benefit the alliance. So Diana's North American office will actually be in Halifax. They're working on opening that right now. It should be open later in the year. And two of the accelerators that are related to that project are in the United States, I believe in Boston and Seattle, if I'm correct. So these are one of the issues that we have worked jointly in the NATO context, we meaning the United States and Canada, recognizing the importance of developing critical technology, ensuring supply chain security in light of the global threat environment and other global events. That's a key deliverable that we're working on implementing. The second I'd offer is the example of the forward land forces, which some folks may know by the older name of the enhanced forward presence. Of course, the US and Canada are two of the framework nations, the US and Poland, and Canada and Latvia, of course. So on a daily basis, we're discussing along with the other framework nations how we need to strengthen and adapt NATO's response through the FLF concept or program operation, whatever you'd like to call it, as the global security environment shifts. So this cooperation, at least in my mind, is possible only because of what I mentioned earlier, the fact that the United States and Canada in the NATO context generally agree, for the most part, generally agree on the major policies. I'd like to highlight just a couple of them. I chose these because they will form part of the summit program this summer, July in Washington. So, of course, NATO's support to Ukraine, building on the decisions at the Bucharest summit, which was in 2008, and again in Vilnius last year. We agree Ukraine's future is in NATO. So the United States, Canada, other allies are working to deliver a concrete plan to help Ukraine defend itself, create a structure to operationalize our support, and really accelerate Ukraine's progress towards NATO membership. That's not to say that, Ukraine will be handed membership at the summit, but we're trying to chart a more detailed path forward. The next I'd highlight is NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific. I think we both countries appreciate that the security of the Indo-Pacific and the security of the Euro-Atlantic are interconnected, and that threats emanating from the Indo-Pacific could affect the alliance territory. We've all seen the reporting on how the DPRK is collaborating with Russia, for example. That's something that's seriously under consideration at NATO. Apologies, my screen almost clicked off. One of the other items I'd say is work related to defense industry. So in the NATO world, we have the Defense Production Action Plan, DPAP, designed to help allies improve their defense capability through increasing their production capacity in a way that is interchangeable or certainly interoperable with other NATO allies. So we know that, for instance, on the Canadian side, we're looking to the Defense Policy Update when that's published to help answer some of those questions. On the US side, Department of Defense released the National Defense Industrial Strategy. So again, collaboration in the NATO sphere on increasing the alliance's capacity to produce defense articles needed to address the security environment. One final one I'd mention, we certainly share dedication to NATO's Women, Peace, and Security agenda. under UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So we've worked together in headquarters and throughout NATO operations and other programming to ensure that that has a place in NATO's core tasks. If you have reviewed the 2022 strategic concept, you'll see that. So a critical piece there. I could go on, but I won't. That's not to say we agree on everything. So that's the other side of the story. I know Dr. Zyla spoke on defense spending and burden sharing. I won't repeat what he said, but I will just say that at least from the U.S. perspective, we view the Vilnius commitments, obviously coming from the Wales commitments. The number is almost irrelevant in a way. It's really about the concept of allies meeting the commitments they've signed up to. And while, yes, it's a political agreement, it is not bounded in international law, it's still a commitment that allies made to one another. So that is the core, I think, of the U.S. position. Related to the issue of capabilities and contributions, we do want allies to continue doing that. And one of the things that is critical for that is investing in military technology, in military capabilities. If you don't do that, at some point, you're going to run out of things to give in terms of capability and contributions to NATO. So that's just how I'd say we look at the burden sharing issue. But even when we disagree, again, alliance unity is the top deliverable for anything. We still get along. And turning specifically back to the U.S. and Canada, we're in a unique position in the NATO context because we are the only two North American allies. So we understand each other, and we share complexities that our European colleagues can't understand or appreciate because they're simply in a different position. So something practical that our capitals are quite far away from Brussels. So we have long and involved hours that our European colleagues do not, as we respond to requests from capital. But I'd say the core is the fact that U.S. and Canadian participation in NORAD. I have to say world's only binational command, as I always like saying that. But at least in my mind, in our mind, that's a key deliverable that the U.S. and Canada offer to NATO under Article 3 related to self-defense first. So, SACEUR's AOR ends at the edge of the European continent. We, the U.S. and Canada, have indicated to NATO that, we got this. We will handle North American security through NORAD and other bilateral collaborations. Our militaries are extremely close. So, NATO is a family. We agree, disagree, but we always stay together. So I think I will leave it at that and happy to take any questions.
Thank you for those wonderful insights. Dr. Lenskova?
Great. Well, thank you very much for bringing back the band together and for inviting me to speak with such great company. I'm going to focus my remarks on how Canada is practicing containment with specific reference to the leadership of the multinational battle group deployed in Latvia that Canada has had as part of the enhanced forward presence that my fellow panelists have already mentioned. In essence, what I want to emphasize in my remarks today is that although Canada has not really clearly conveyed its international strategy, whether in leadership statements or its own government documents, its actions do amount essentially to a strategy of containment. That is, Canada is using various diplomatic, economic, and military tools to impose costs on Russian aggression in the hopes of limiting it. The most tangible piece of evidence for this strategy is indeed its leadership of the multinational battle group that Canada leads as a framework nation in the Baltic country of Latvia. And so between 2017 and 2022, Canada has provided the military backbone of what is arguably the most diverse battle group of the 4 EFP battle groups deployed to the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in addition to Poland. And so to this end, during that particular time period, Canada has provided between 400 and 600 military personnel and their associated equipment. This and the other EFP battle groups serve to assure Latvia that the alliance treats that country's security needs very seriously. They also serve to deter Russia from repeating the sort of territorial aggression that has made against Ukraine since 2014. To be sure, the character of the EFP do not serve to intimidate Russia. It's largely limited to the size of a battalion, and as such, the EFP battle groups have no offensive potential that would directly threaten Russian interests. I would argue that the deployment between 2017 and 2022 was largely a success story. Some of the worries that had attended the creation of the EFP never came to pass. Members of the local population in Latvia welcomed their presence. There were no controversies surrounding the behavior of the forward deployed troops, at least not in Latvia. Although relatively skeptical of NATO compared to their co-nationals, members of the Russophone or ethnic Russian minority community in Latvia has generally accepted their presence as well. Militarily, the fact that the EFP battle group in Latvia has 10 countries has been more of an asset than a liability, not least because it advances a high degree of alliance solidarity. Moreover, the EFP battle group in Latvia trains very rigorously to achieve certification towards the end of their 6-month rotational periods. And so their partnership with those Latvian military units in country do make for a good degree of combat credibility. Of course, 2022 was a hinge moment, not least because Russia ratcheted up its military aggression against Ukraine with a full-scale invasion. Canada expanded its use of sanctions against Russia while also increasing its support for Ukraine, going as far as to sign a bilateral security agreement just a month ago. For the Baltic countries, the events bore an ambiguous meaning. On the one hand, the operational setbacks experienced by the Russian armed forces meant that those military units positioned typically in Kaliningrad or Pskov near Estonia and Latvia suffered extreme losses. On the other hand, Russia showed much determination to go about realizing its geopolitical objectives that we can, I think, properly describe as revanchist. And so if Russia were to succeed in Ukraine, there's no assuring that any one of the Baltic countries would not be next. Latvia thus no longer saw the battalion-sized battle groups as sufficiently sized for the increased threat that Russia now posed. And so there were doubts about whether Canada could really reinforce those battle groups or its own battle group, not least because of the timescales and geographical distances involved in any such armed conflict. Thus, Latvia and the other Baltic countries pushed successfully at the 2022 Madrid summit for NATO to upgrade the EFP battle groups to the size of a brigade, essentially quadrupling the personnel count. Now, I think this is where things could get very well tricky for Canada and, of course, Latvia. And I'm pitching somewhat a report that I have coming out, this very week with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute on Canada and Latvian efforts as regards to the EFP battle group in that latter country. This is a report that I've co-authored with my Latvian friend and colleague, Toms Rostoks. And basically, we identify the state of play. To put it simply, Canada's force posture is already very strained. Officials, whether civilian or leader or military, are quick to assure that the deployment will remain military effective and immune from some of the larger budgetary difficulties that the Canadian government, or for that matter, the Department of National Defense, currently facing. However, at least beyond 2026 and 2027, it's hard to see how Canada could credibly go about the strategy of containment it has justifiably decided to adopt. Years of budgetary neglect and protracted acquisition projects have left the Canadian Armed Forces severely under-equipped and understaffed. I know we want to think about burden sharing more comprehensively, but the fact of the matter is that the best predictor of defense outputs is defense inputs, and that does mean more money. As such, capability gaps that the Canadian Armed Forces have suffered over the years have only widened over the course of the last 10 years. To put matters into perspective, I heard the other day that Canada only has 3 M777s at this moment. That is appalling. We don't even train pilots anymore. Aggravating matters is that the Canadian Armed Forces is increasingly deployed on the home front to go about natural disaster relief. And so these issues strain an already frayed force that is struggling to recruit, to train, and to retain its own personnel. For its part, Latvia does appreciate the difficulties that Canada is facing, has not been idle, having increased its own defense budget considerably in order to acquire new weapon systems such as air defense in a joint initiative with Estonia. It has also been investing in a very large training ground in the south of the country in Salonia to accommodate the expanded foreign military presence within its own borders. Latvia has also undertaken efforts to increase personnel numbers through conscription, or even voluntary conscription at that. Relations between Latvia and Canada are very solid, but there is very reasonable concern about Canada's medium to long-term ability of providing extended deterrence. Now, of course, Latvia does not want to compromise this relationship. Partly for this reason, I believe Latvia decided not to join Estonia and Lithuania in considering the use of anti-personnel mines to fortify the Baltic countries' frontier, the so-called Baltic Defense Line, with Russia. I think the optics of breaking a treaty called the Ottawa Convention would not be positive in this regard. But still, it goes to show that Latvia appreciates the difficulties that Canada is facing. It's taken steps on its own right to ensure maximal chances of success if something were to go wrong. So in sum, Canada is pursuing a strategy of containment. The Canadian-led deployment in Latvia is testament to that strategy. Things have been working reasonably well for Canada in this regard since 2017, but many serious challenges remain. They appear only to be mounting. Though Canada has exceeded expectations in being a framework nation for Latvia, the next few years will be all the same very difficult. Thank you very much. Nicole, I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry, my internet keeps cutting out. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations today. For our audience members, you are welcome to use the raise hand function if you want to present your question yourself, or write it in the chat. As the moderator's prerogative, I'm going to ask the first question. My question is related to Canada's in line 110 of Strong, Secure, Engaged, it stated that Canada was going to conduct joint exercises with Arctic allies and partners and support the strengthening of situational awareness and information sharing in the Arctic, including with NATO. Now, some have said this line represents a significant pivot in Canada's policy towards NATO, while others have argued it's just rhetoric and Canada's overall position hasn't really changed. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or perspectives on whether or not Canada underwent a NATO shift.
I can at least offer a few comments on that, if I may. I don't think Canada underwent a fundamental shift. The fact is that we cooperate on a near daily basis, certainly bilaterally, in the Arctic security sphere through different types of operations with our respective forces, certainly within the NORAD context, which does cover the Arctic region, and that's something moving forward. Going back to what I said earlier, I think there's a recognition that Sakir has the European Arctic. That's kind of his thing, and the U.S. and Canada will take care of the North American defense, including in the Arctic region. That's not to say that when we don't have broader exercises, we can't have NATO allies participating in that. That's certainly something that we've seen when there's Optanuk, for instance, or some type of other operation. We do have NATO participation. And certainly we have U.S. and Canadian participation in some of the operations going on in the European Arctic. So I think if I could say it's business as usual. I don't think Canada has shifted in its position. I'll be interested to see how they cover that perhaps in the DPU.
Thank you so much for your insight. Does anyone else want to weigh in, or we can take the next question? Okay, Nick, would you like to present your first question? I know you have, we're very excited about the opportunity to do so.
I think there's some questions in the chat that I think might be best to go first. I know Olivia, Gabriella, and Mihai also has his hand up.
Okay, Mihai, your hand's up. You can go first.
Awesome, thanks, Nicole. Can everybody hear me? Awesome. So this question goes to Dr. Lanoshka. So you're talking earlier about the immense equipment deficiencies regarding what the CAF is facing, and which I very much agree with. But what I really wanted to ask, though, is how do you think the CAF can be able to benefit from getting an absolute serious air defense capability, like for instance with the Patriot system, especially considering how Ukrainians have reportedly been able to use them against the Kinzhal missile during the Ukraine war. So I wanted to know if you can be able to comment on like what are the possible benefits for the CAF to obtain such a capability. Thank you.
My understanding to this effect is that Canada has recently acquired a Swedish-made system for, in fact, the FP battle group in order to address a particular capability gap that had been fairly apparent for some time. And indeed, precisely because the Russian invasion of Ukraine has exposed the importance of air defense, we are seeing those frontline countries like Estonia, like Latvia, and so forth make renewed efforts in this regard. Hence, Estonia and Latvia are acquiring air defense. Canada is, of course, different because of its continental posture and its relationship with the United States by way of NORAD. So air defense looks a little differently. But in terms of the tactical units postured in Latvia, only very recently Canada has actually made significant efforts in that regard. But still, with respect to the capabilities that battle group has required, some still relate to command control, computing, electronic warfare, and so forth. And so some observers have noted that in addition to air defense, those other capability requirements remain significant. And unfortunately, recent budgets or spending announcements do not seem to take account those particular needs.
Wonderful. Olivia has posed a question in the chat directed towards Dr. Zila. What are some other ways that member nations can contribute to NATO, and how can these contributions be publicized, potentially considering or countering notions that GDP is the only and most important way to contribute to NATO?
Yeah, thanks very much. And perhaps I just looked at the chat, and perhaps I can take the next one together, and in talking about some of the methodological problems. I mean, in my first book, I looked at sort of Canada's Balkans missions, and indeed one of the arguments I made there, in addition to saying that we actually did contribute to, what is expected as a middle power, we contributed significantly to building NATO politically. We contribute to NATO, building NATO politically in terms of building NATO infrastructure, in terms of, helping NATO to think about the security development nexus. So think about, bringing aid and those kinds of things as part of the CIMIC operation on the ground in the 1990s. Now, I'm not saying that, things have changed ever since the 1990s. NATO's crisis management operations did change since 2014 back towards perhaps more deterrence. So and this sort of leads me into talking about some of the methodological problems. about NATO burden sharing. We always have to consider, well, is NATO's public good actually changing? Like I said, during the Cold War, NATO's public goods was about deterrence. In the post-Cold War era, up until about 1999, 2000 or so, it was about crisis management. Then it was about fighting terrorism in Afghanistan, and now it's back to deterrence. But sort of methodologically speaking, that's difficult to kind of measure how each country contributes to the provision of the public good. The second point is that NATO member states measure their burden sharing contributions differently. For example, some countries include soldiers' pensions, healthcare contributions, civilians working in the Ministry of Defense towards their NATO share, which is of course impossible to compare if not everybody does that, or if NATO doesn't actually count that out, which they don't. The third point, and this is it's a political point, but nonetheless a methodologically important point, is to consider that the Americans, of course, have a global foreign policy outlook. So their strategy is thinking globally, versus Canada and most European countries, if not all European countries, actually think in the European context. And so the Americans are also preoccupied with the Indo-Pacific, as Jennifer alluded to. But it's if you actually look at the Americans' share of the defense spending that they contribute towards NATO, it's actually significantly lower than the Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong here. What is it? Close to 4% of your GDP you're spending on
yes
on defense.
Yes.
And so, you would have to calculate that the global outlook out of those 4% ish of the GDP. In terms of sort of scientifically speaking, I think what we need to this sort of rationalist model of collective action doesn't tell you anything about understanding burden sharing for domestic polity, but also understanding the practice of burden sharing going back to 1949. In fact, what I would argue is that whatever we've been seeing since 1949, the complaining about Europeans and Canadians not sharing enough of the collective NATO burden has actually become something like a cultural practice. It's like a habit that politicians, but certain policymakers and political commentators have made to essentially promote a certain agenda. But methodologically speaking, there's a very, very strong rationality assumption that, and we may disagree on this here on the panel, but the input side of whatever you put in terms of money into the NATO alliance does not necessarily automatically produce capabilities. It's necessary to eventually produce those capabilities. But if we just consider how inefficiently European NATO member states actually spend on defense, there's different artillery systems, there's different weapon systems, not to speak of the defense budgets that actually haven't been fully spent in most European countries and Canada. So in Canada, the Department of National Defense gives back millions of dollars back to the Treasury Board because they couldn't spend the funding. And so these are some of the, I would say, methodologically and politically complex issues. And it's not just sort of, whatever you put into an alliance produces a certain output. There's much more to it, I would argue.
Nicole had to leave there due to her Wi-Fi, but thank you for your answer, Dr. Zyla. Dr. Lenoshka, I know you're about to leave, but I have a quick question for you now that I'm taking over the Q&A here. Talk about containment, Canada, Latvia, and the battle group there. But when we think about kind of that strategic shift from appeasement to containment with the alliance as a whole, is there one policy decision that you think kind of describes that best? Is it Sweden and Finland's accession to the alliance? Is it something else, perhaps?
My general view is that the 2016 Warsaw Summit was probably the most significant NATO summit, precisely because it lent greater clarity as to how NATO is going to posture itself with the creation of the enhanced forward presence. Already at the 2014 Wales Summit, as you know, there was a spending commitment made. There was the announcement of a very high readiness joint task force, but there were questions about what that military formation, how it would even look, how it would even work in practice. And so the EFP in some ways came out of an effort to solidify what NATO was going to do, but in a manner that would have taken into account certain concerns that some NATO countries would have had about antagonizing Russia or provoking Russia for that matter. So I think that is the signature move made by NATO. I'm not sure it's necessarily the only one that could have been made. I'm still somewhat surprised that the NATO-Russia Funding Act remains operative, because it was signed in 1997 with a clear provision that in the foreseeable security environment, NATO would refrain from positioning substantial numbers of combat forces on relatively new territory within NATO, despite the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and despite, of course, the full-scale invasion in 2022. We still seem to be attached to that document. It's not just the usual suspects like Germany, but even the United States has expressed support for that document. At least it did so in the last year or two in the past NATO summit. So to answer your question in brief, the FP, absolutely. I think it would have been even more significant to abrogate the NRFA, but we haven't yet done that for whatever reason. And so the FP is actually not a terrible consolation prize. It's actually very practical all the same.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you. I got a message in the chat about, for all of you, just how you think Sweden and Finland's membership changes the alliance moving forward. And I know you're about to leave, so
yeah, I can answer this question first precisely because I have to leave in 1 or 2 minutes. But I think it's easy to overstate the importance of Sweden and Finland joining the alliance. What those countries being in the alliance does is to remove certain inefficiencies. They were already collaborating quite significantly with various NATO countries. In fact, Finland was buying large numbers of F-35 aircraft. Even during the Cold War, Sweden was officially neutral, but really on the side of the United States. But considering the complexity of the environment that characterizes the Baltic littoral region, having Sweden and Finland be permanent members of the North Atlantic Council basically ensures greater predictability and allows for greater contact and cooperation than would otherwise be the case. But again, their standards were very much aligned with what NATO was doing already. They were already collaborating quite significantly. In fact, both of those countries were involved in Afghanistan in collaboration with NATO members. So from a practical standpoint, easy to exaggerate. From a spiritual standpoint, it does break with significant tradition. And so that also is important on its own right for symbolic reasons. Unfortunately, I have to get going, but thank you so much for the chat. I wish I could stay a few minutes longer, but unfortunately I cannot. But thank you. Great seeing you all.
Thank you very much. Great to see you.
Cheers. Bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Dr. Zeiler and Ms. Tierney, do you want to add to that at all? Or do you want me to change topic here?
Thank you. So I'd certainly agree with what Dr. Januszka said. In politically speaking, it was a significant shift to have Sweden and Finland join the alliance, given their history of non-alignment. But in practical terms, it really just completed the puzzle. When I was in Brussels, we would often refer to them as NATO light, because they were allies in all but name. They were so integrated into NATO's work, obviously respecting that boundary where things become allies only. but it's just a natural fit. It was the natural next step. So having them formally in the alliance now, as Dr. Yanushka said, kind of remove some of those roadblocks or obstacles where we couldn't share certain information or we couldn't bring them into certain planning because it was allies only. So now that they're in the club, we're able to share completely. They have an active role in decision making as well. So I think it strengthens the capabilities of the alliance. There's also, I know, been some talk that it really has fundamentally shifted at least the geography of NATO now that we have two more Arctic states within the alliance. So happy to have them in. Practically speaking, um, um, uh, they were always meant to come in, but I understand the political dynamics and how that represents a great shift.
I think the only thing I could add, I fully agree with what our colleagues have said. The only thing I would add is that NATO basically now has control of the Western Baltic Sea, so that all now sort of belongs to NATO territory, if you wish. And that has an advantage in the sense of you have full control not only over the Baltic Sea, but also intelligence capabilities. The island of Gotland is vitally important in that regard, to listening into Russia and the operations that it conducts there with the undersea and all those kinds of things. So I think it has a strategic advantage to have them in the alliance, in addition to what my colleagues have already said about the political and military advantages.
That's great, thank you. And I know we're coming up on time, and there's a few people left in the attendance, but I really want to ask you two different questions. So for Ms. Tierney, can you talk a little bit about Joint Force Command Norfolk and relative time, of course, but the kind of the importance that there is a NATO command now in North America, and just kind of your general musings on that. And for Dr. Zyla, there's kind of this, with burden sharing, there's this political sentiment that the US kind of buys allies with defense spending, and that's why Canada, for example, is a laggard on defense spending, and it's always kind of this political take. Can you just ruminate on that as much as you would like?
Okay, so the fact that we now have JFC Norfolk, which is obviously one of NATO's 3 operational commands, the only one located in North America, as you mentioned. So the main purpose, I think, or the importance of having that command is the fact that it can serve a function that's really protecting the transatlantic link. Because we do have, obviously, when we talk about the North Atlantic, we're talking about the European side, but we're also talking about the North American side. And symbolically, you have, a physical command that shows the transatlantic nature of the alliance, which is critical and really can't be overstated. So symbolically, I think it's important to show that transatlantic bond. The fact that it is present in North America, I think, brings us added capabilities to ensure that the transatlantic link is certainly not broken in the event of some type of military situation or conflict, and also gives a bit of a NATO, I don't want to say presence, but gives a NATO look at the North American Arctic without infringing upon what the U.S. and Canada have established in terms of NORAD and other bilateral, binational procedures, policies, etc. So I frankly look at it more as something symbolic that's important. Obviously, there are, a number of detailed operational considerations that could be made, but I think at least personally speaking, it's a nod to the transatlantic bond. The fact that we have them here. Of course, there's the long history of having SAC-T also present in Norfolk, so we had that presence as well. So NATO has been present literally in Norfolk, Virginia for quite some time. But the fact that we have a joint force command is important. I think certainly in the world where NATO has developed regional plans as well, it could be particularly useful to have that command present as NATO looks to figure out how it would staff each of the regional plans. JFC Norfolk can play a critical role in that. So I hope that's not too vague, but I can't overstate the importance, first of all, symbolically, of having that in order to represent that transatlantic bond.
Thank you. That was what I was looking for. Dr. Zyla?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question, which is a very broad question on sort of, so let me just sort of perhaps, provide a more commentary answer than perhaps an analytical answer. The first point is, I think, to think about Canada as a middle power, and it's precisely that. We're not the first at the party, and we never show up at the party the first. We show up sort of, halfway through the evening, and we usually have a good time. And we do provide, some beverages when showing up to the party. But we tend to compare ourselves to the United States, which is, comparing apples and I'm actually not quite sure what the proper analogy would be, but there's an incomprehensible, power sort of relationship, and the simple sheer size of what Canada is and what the United States is in terms of its people, and the military capabilities that are behind it. We tend to compare ourselves to the United States, but it's the wrong comparison. We need to compare ourselves to other middle powers. The second point is, when we talk about sort of NATO burden sharing and burden sharing sort of in general, I would suggest that we should more look at sort of the practice of burden sharing. And that brings me to the daily practice of, sharing the burden in North America with the United States. It's not that we're sort of hiding behind a stone and that the Americans take over. I mean, we practice security on a daily basis, and Jennifer can talk to this, or speak about this much more in detail than I can. But certainly, the practice of North American security is something that we do on a daily basis that is very integrated, that is very ingrained in our sort of daily security procedures. I mean, let's just not forget that the deputy commander of NORAD is actually Canadian, and the deputy commander of NORAD was actually the one in charge on 9/11 and sort of directed, was actually responsible for North American airspace, not only Canadian airspace, but North American airspace. And I think that just demonstrates that the Americans are trusting a Canadian their airspace, the command and control of their airspace. And so, I mean, I wouldn't sort of just, underestimate that importance of an integrated bilateral Canada-US relationship. I think we need to move away a little bit from, punishing ourselves all the time by comparing us to the United States. Now, to be frank and to be totally clear, I'm not saying that we should not invest into military capabilities at all, and sort of instead, buy some cookies or some candies. Far from it. But I do think, and this is perhaps the last point to make, certainly in this environment of high inflation, and some other sort of problems that Canada has domestically at the moment, I think it's vital to explain to Canadians, what is this money for? What is it spent on? And how can we be actually much more efficient with the funds that the Department of National Defense has at the moment in terms of getting the capabilities that we currently need. I mean, if we just look at sort of what NATO allies have made available to Ukraine to defend itself, I would actually argue it's not a question of money at the moment. It's more a question of getting the military equipment to Ukraine. So essentially, buying it from wherever it is available and shipping it to Ukraine. So it's not so much that we are lacking money, it's a question that we're lacking, for example, ammunition that can be delivered to Ukraine. And more money will actually not solve, at least not in the sort of medium-term perspective, that kind of problem. So we need to think differently about this input argument, but rather think about, well, how can we actually be much more efficient with what we do and how we do things on a daily basis? If the European NATO members, for example, would, and I would actually include Canada in this perhaps, would think more about, developing, or agreeing to develop certain types of technology that sort of every NATO country uses, perhaps 2-3 different weapon systems, that would bring us much further ahead than we currently have this sort of, wood of different sort of weapon systems that are of course hard to replenish if you're, for example, running out of ammunition, if the ammunition is not compatible, and those kinds of things. So in other words, if you increase your interoperability and just concentrate on buying, let's say 1, 2, 3 weapon system, that would be way more efficient for NATO and would get us much more bang for the buck than we currently have. But Jennifer, you may disagree with me on that one, or may add some additional points.
No, I think that's well said. There's a number of things I could offer, but I'll let Nicholas get to his next question.
We're actually out of time, but thank you very much for going over time. If you want to stay and talk about that, feel free to. It's up to you.
Don't offer me extra time on NATO. I'll be here forever.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much. And to Dr. Lenoshka as well, who had to leave early. Thank you for spending your time with us. We were a small but mighty group, and I think that was a great discussion. Next week is NAADSN's 4th and final panel in this Ideas series. We will explore NATO's future on Thursday, April 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And to register, please go to naadsn.ca/events. And that's all for today. Thank you so much, and see you next week.